What if I told you that everything you've been told about power, control, and darkness is only half the truth? What if the very thing that promises you freedom is actually the thing silently taking it away? Stay with me, because what I am about to share isn't theory. It's a real story from someone who lived in the shadows and found a truth so powerful it changed everything. Her name is Amara. She was born in a small village in Nigeria, where spiritual traditions run deep and unseen forces are part of everyday life. From a young age, she was introduced to practices many fear and few understand. Over time, she became deeply involved in witchcraft, seeking power, control, and answers. But what she found was not what she expected. Amara's earliest understanding of power did not come from books or formal teaching, but from observation and repetition inside a tightly controlled environment where belief was shaped more by experience than explanation. At first, everything appeared symbolic, almost harmless in the way a child might treat rituals as games without fully understanding their meaning. She was taught that unseen forces responded to intention, words, and specific actions, and this idea slowly formed the foundation of her belief system. What made it compelling was not just the instruction itself, but the results she believed she was witnessing. Small coincidences began to feel like confirmation. A thought she held would seem to align with an event shortly after, and over time, her mind started connecting patterns that reinforced the idea that she was gaining influence over circumstances beyond ordinary control. This created a psychological loop where expectation shaped perception and perception strengthened expectation. The more she believed she was seeing outcomes influenced by her actions, the more committed she became to continuing them, even when the results were inconsistent or unclear. What she did not initially recognize was how easily the human mind can assign meaning to randomness when it is emotionally invested in finding it. As she grew deeper into these practices, the sense of empowerment became more structured and demanding. There were rules, sequences, and conditions that were presented as necessary to maintain balance or effectiveness. This is where the illusion of power began to feel more tangible because structure often gives the impression of mastery. When a person is given a system, especially one that is complex and layered, they often begin to associate memorization and discipline with control. Amara found herself spending increasing amounts of time trying to perfect details, believing that precision would lead to stronger outcomes. However, instead of feeling freer, she began to notice an underlying tension that never fully disappeared. There was always something to maintain, something to repeat, something to correct. Her attention became anchored to whether she had done things correctly, and that dependency slowly shifted her mindset from curiosity into obligation. At the same time, subtle emotional changes began to emerge, though she did not immediately connect them to her experiences. She started noticing periods of heightened anxiety that would come without clear cause, followed by emotional exhaustion after intense focus on these practices. Relationships around her began to feel distant, not necessarily because people changed, not necessarily because people changed, but because her attention was increasingly consumed by an internal world that others could not see or participate in. This created a quiet separation between her and her surroundings. Even in moments of social interaction, part of her mind remained preoccupied with interpretation, analysis, and anticipation of outcomes she believed were connected to her actions. Over time, this created a dual experience of reality, one that was external and ordinary, and another that was internal and highly charged with meaning. The more she invested in the internal framework, the less satisfying the external world became because it felt less significant compared to the heightened sense of importance she attached to her private experiences. What initially felt like empowerment gradually revealed a different layer, dependency. She began to feel that if she did not engage in certain practices or maintain certain patterns, something would become unbalanced or uncertain in her life. This belief did not always present itself as fear in an obvious way, but rather as hesitation, doubt, and the discomfort of not doing enough. This is one of the subtle mechanisms that often strengthens any belief system. When action is tied to emotional relief, the absence of action begins to feel like risk. Even when nothing concrete changed externally, the internal discomfort was enough to guide her behavior. She found herself returning to routines not because she was convinced of their visible outcomes every time, but because they temporarily reduced the feeling of uncertainty. In this way, the practices became less about discovery and more about emotional regulation, though she did not have the language at the time to recognize it. The cost of this growing internal focus was not immediate in a dramatic sense, but gradual and cumulative. Her sense of spontaneity began to fade, replaced by calculated thought, patterns that filtered almost every experience through interpretation. She started analyzing events in real time, searching for hidden meaning, even in ordinary situations. This heightened state of mental engagement created fatigue, but it also created a sense of significance that was difficult to let go of. Ordinary life began to feel less vivid unless it was framed through the lens of her internal system. This is where the illusion became most powerful, not because of external reinforcement alone, but because of the mind's ability to find identity within structured belief. The practices were no longer just actions, they became part of how she understood herself, her choices, and her place in the world. And as this identification deepened, so did the difficulty of stepping outside it, because questioning the system also meant questioning the version of herself that had been built within it. One of the most defining moments in Amara's journey came when the weight of everything she had been carrying internally reached a point where it could no longer be ignored. Up until that moment, her life had been shaped by patterns that felt both familiar and confining, but she had learned to adapt to them in ways that made them seem manageable. However, there are experiences in life that slowly build pressure beneath the surface, not through a single dramatic event, but through accumulation, small moments of discomfort, unanswered questions, emotional fatigue, and the quiet realization that something essential no longer feels aligned. For Amara, this turning point did not arrive as clarity, but as collapse. It was a moment where the systems she relied on for stability no longer provided reassurance, and instead of feeling guided, she felt suspended in uncertainty. What made this moment powerful was not external change, but internal disorientation, as if the framework she had used to interpret reality suddenly stopped explaining what she was experiencing. In that space of uncertainty, her mind began to question what had previously been unquestionable. This questioning was not immediate liberation, it was uncomfortable, even frightening, because it challenged the very foundation of her understanding of control and consequence. When a person's identity is closely tied to a belief system, even doubt can feel like instability. Yet within that instability, something new begins to form. Amara started noticing that many of the outcomes she had once attributed to specific actions or rituals could also be explained in simpler, more grounded ways. This realization did not erase her experiences, but it changed how she interpreted them. Instead of seeing patterns as evidence of external forces responding to her, she began to consider how the human mind naturally seeks connections, especially in environments where uncertainty is emotionally difficult to tolerate. This shift was subtle but significant because it introduced the possibility that meaning might not always come from control, but from interpretation itself. As this internal questioning deepened, she experienced a strange duality. On one side, there was fear of losing everything she had believed in, and on the other side, there was a growing awareness that holding on to those beliefs was becoming increasingly difficult. It was within this tension this at the turning point fully revealed itself. One night, during a period of intense emotional exhaustion, she reached a moment where she could no longer continue in the same way. It was not a dramatic external event, but an internal surrender of certainty. In that moment, she did something she had rarely done before. She allowed herself to sit with the unknown without immediately trying to shape it into meaning. This simple act of not forcing answers created an unexpected shift. Instead of feeling immediate resolution, she experienced a quiet stillness that did not depend on control or interpretation. It was unfamiliar, almost unsettling, because it did not follow the patterns she had been conditioned to expect. Following this turning point, Amara encountered ideas and perspectives that contrasted sharply with everything she had previously accepted. These were not just alternative beliefs, but fundamentally different ways of understanding life, identity, and purpose. What struck her most was not the content alone, but the tone, messages centered on clarity without fear and understanding without dependency on control. For someone who had lived within systems defined by structure and consequence, this introduced an entirely different possibility that stability might not come from managing unseen forces, but from releasing the constant need to interpret everything as a sign. This realization did not instantly transform her life, but it began to loosen the internal grip that had kept her thoughts locked in repetitive cycles. She started to see that peace did not require perfect understanding, and that not every question needed an immediate answer to be meaningful. The discovery that began to take shape within her was less about replacing one belief system with another and more about recognizing the mental space that existed beyond both fear and control. She began to notice that when she stopped trying to predict or interpret every experience, her mind became quieter. This quietness was not emptiness, but a form of relief she had not previously associated with awareness. It allowed her to observe thoughts without immediately attaching significance to them, and to experience moments without layering them with hidden meaning. Over time, this created a subtle but profound shift in how she related to herself. Instead of constantly evaluating whether she was doing things correctly within a system, she began to explore what it felt like to simply exist without constant internal measurement. In that exploration, she encountered a form of understanding that did not demand effort or maintenance, but instead emerged naturally when the pressure to control was reduced. Living the life she once knew was not a single decision made in clarity, but a gradual unraveling of attachment that happened in stages, often marked by resistance, doubt, and emotional conflict. Even after her turning point and the initial discovery of a quieter mental space, Amara did not immediately abandon everything she had practiced or believed. Human attachment to identity is rarely intellectual alone. It is deeply emotional, shaped by familiarity, repetition, and the sense of belonging that even difficult systems can provide. For her, the practices were not just actions, but a structure that had given her a sense of direction for a long time. To step away from them meant stepping into a kind of emptiness that felt uncertain, and uncertainty often pulls people back into what is familiar, even if it is uncomfortable. So her process of walking away was not linear. It involved returning to old patterns during moments of doubt, questioning whether she had made a mistake, and experiencing internal conflict between the pull of the past and the possibility of something different. W had made this stage particularly challenging was that change was no longer about external behavior alone, but about internal identity reconstruction. She began to notice how much of her self understanding had been built around being someone who knew or someone who could influence outcomes. Letting go of that identity created a psychological void that needed to be faced rather than filled immediately. In that space, she experienced emotional fluctuations that were difficult to explain, moments of relief followed by moments of uncertainty, clarity followed by doubt. Yet within this instability, something important was happening. She was learning to separate her sense of self from the systems she had once depended on. Instead of seeing herself as defined by practices or outcomes, she slowly began to observe herself as someone capable of choice outside of those frameworks. This shift may sound subtle, but internally it represented a significant reorganization of perception because it moved her from identification with the system to observation of her own experience within and beyond it. Over time, the repetition of stepping away, even imperfectly, began to weaken the emotional hold of her previous patterns. She started to recognize that the discomfort she felt when not engaging in old routines was temporary and that it did not necessarily indicate danger or loss of control. This realization was crucial because much of her earlier dependency had been maintained by the assumption that discomfort meant something was wrong. As she stayed with that discomfort instead of immediately escaping it, she discovered that it gradually diminished on its own. This allowed her to build a new form of confidence, not based on certainty or control, but on the ability to remain present without immediate resolution. In this way, walking away became less about rejection of her past and more about reconditioning her response to uncertainty itself. The more she experienced life without relying on old frameworks, the more she realized that stability could exist without constant interpretation or intervention, and that clarity often emerged naturally when the pressure to force it was removed. As this internal shift deepened, her life began to take on a different rhythm. She became more aware of simple, ordinary experiences that had previously been overshadowed by constant internal analysis. Conversations, surroundings, and everyday moments started to feel less like symbolic events requiring interpretation and more like direct experiences to be lived. This change did not erase her past, but it changed her relationship to it. Instead of viewing her earlier life solely through the lens of fear or judgment, she began to understand it as part of a complex psychological and emotional journey that shaped her awareness. This broader perspective allowed her to move forward without being trapped in regret or denial, but with a growing sense of groundedness that came from integration rather than avoidance. In time, the purpose she developed was not based on returning to who she was before, but on sharing what she had learned through experience. Her communication became centered on awareness, not as a doctrine, but as an invitation for reflection. She began to express that much of human struggle comes from the constant need to control, define, and predict, and that there is a different way of engaging with life that involves observation rather than domination. Her life became a reflection of that understanding, not as a perfect or final state, but as an ongoing process of learning to exist without excessive internal pressure. In this new phase, meaning was no longer something she had to extract from every moment, but something that unfolded naturally when she allowed experience to be what it was, without forcing it into predetermined structures or expectations. After everything Amara experienced, What stands out most is not just the story of where she came from, but the deeper transformation in how she began to understand life itself. Her journey shows how easily the human mind can attach meaning to patterns, systems, and beliefs, especially when searching for control in moments of uncertainty. What once felt like power slowly revealed itself as dependence, and what once felt like certainty gradually dissolved into questions she could no longer ignore. Yet within that unraveling, she did not find destruction. She found space. Space to think differently, to feel differently, and eventually to live without the constant pressure of interpreting every moment as something hidden or controlled by unseen forces. Her growth was not about replacing one extreme with another, but about learning to step back from extremes altogether and observe life with a quieter mind. In that quietness, she discovered that peace does not always come from having all the answers, but from no longer need, aiding to force them. And from that understanding, she rebuilt herself, not around fear or control, but around awareness, reflection, and the freedom to simply exist without constant inner conflict. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and thought provoking narratives like this.